Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Van Leeuwen, and thank you for coming to our session. I am a philosopher at Georgia State University, and my co-authors are Kara Weissman and Tanya Lerman of Stanford University, Anthropology and Psychology. And our title today is Think and Believe Across Cultures, a shared folk distinction between two cognitive attitudes in the US, Ghana, Thailand, China, and Vanuatu. Here's my outline for today. First, I'll introduce the target phenomenon, the background literature, and our main hypothesis. And then, since this is a cross-cultural study, I'll introduce the locations and languages in which we did our research. Then we'll move on to the studies themselves. Study 1 is a forced choice sentence completion task. Study 2 is a free response sentence completion task. Study 3 is a vignette study that controlled for ascribed attitude content. And don't worry, I'll explain what that means when we get there. And then we'll pull back and conclude with our broader interpretation, some directions for future research, and the broader lesson we want to draw about human cognition. So here's our target phenomenon. Humans are capable of having various cognitive attitudes. For any given idea, one might think that it's raining, one might suppose that it's raining, one might imagine or pretend that it's raining in, say, a game of make-believe. And humans have the cognitive flexibility to relate to an idea like it's raining in a number of different ways. And furthermore, people are generally capable of representing such differences. So it's not just that we have different ways of relating to ideas, we can also attribute them to one another and to ourselves, and that's a capacity that falls under theory of mind or under a slightly different terminology, social cognition. So these are broad background facts, at least I take them to be such, but there has been some developments in the recent literature in cognitive science of religion that throw a wrinkle into the mix. And that is that some researchers, myself included, as well as my co-author Tanya Lerman, have argued that there's a difference in what we might call varieties of beliefs. In particular, we've argued for a distinction between religious credence and factual belief. So one is a more reverential, identity-constituting way of relating to ideas, and the other is just much more matter-of-fact, taking things to be a certain way. So you might say, Jane thinks Margaret Thatcher is alive, say she hasn't heard the news, versus Jeff believes that Jesus Christ is alive. So setting aside the differences in the individuals that are about Jesus versus Margaret Thatcher, the attitudes themselves are different, or at least so some of us argue. Well, that raises the following question if you put it together with the previous point. And that's our current research question. Does ordinary theory of mind ability or layperson social cognition track the difference between religious credence and factual belief? So that's the question that we're asking today. At the level of theory of mind, do people grasp the difference? Well, there is some background literature that addresses that. And in particular, there's a study that was done by Larissa Heiphetz, Casey Landers, and myself that looked at language usage. And we found that the verb think is preferred for matter-of-fact attitude descriptions, and believe is preferred for religious attitude descriptions. And this is among speakers of American English. Importantly, the study we did, we controlled for features of content, perceived truth, level of certainty, and even religiosity. So we concluded in our research that American English speakers track distinct attitudes of religious versus matter-of-fact belief, or in my terms, religious credence versus factual belief. And I should say we did sentence completion tasks as well as corpus linguistics research, and we got the same effect essentially. Well, that raises the next question, which is that general? Is it just an artifact of American English speakers, or is it something that will show up in a cross-culturally robust way? And the hypothesis of the current research is that the ability to track the difference between religious and matter-of-fact belief is indeed cross-culturally robust. That's really what we set out to test. So, given that this is cross-cultural, we should transition to where did we do the studies? So here are our locations and languages. First, I should mention, this was part of a larger project that was spearheaded by Tanya Lerman that explored how do culturally differing ideas about minds impact spiritual experiences. So we were just one facet of that larger research program. And the locations for this research were very culturally diverse. So our locations included the United States, Ghana, and we explored Fanta speakers in rural Ghana, Thailand, China, and Vanuatu. That's a Melanesian island. Importantly, and you'll see why this is relevant later, most participants in 3 of those locations did not speak English. Now, since we were extending the research that I did with Larissa Heiphetz and Casey Landers, we were looking at contrasting verb pairs. So the language we used in the United States was English, and we focused on the verb pair think versus believe. In Fanta, our hypothesized counterpart verbs were duen and gyedzi, relatively similar to think and believe. In Thai, it was kid and chiu. In Mandarin, renwei and xiangxin. And in Bislama, which is an English Creole, ting and belief. And all our stimuli were back translated to ensure as much accuracy as possible. I should mention, for the linguists in the audience today, we weren't resting our research on the assumption that these were exact semantic matches. Rather, we were testing the prediction that these verb pairs would be used to mark the same contrast in different contexts. So let's turn to study 1, our forced choice experiment. And here it's best just to start with the stimuli that we gave our participants. So participants would see sentences like the following in most locations, or hear them in Ghana because it was oral presentation in Ghana. They would see sentences like this: Patrick thinks or believes that Brazil is in South America, and they had to circle 1. Nick believes or thinks that bronze contains more copper than tin. Gustav thinks or believes that his final paper was due on June 18th. Dwayne thinks or believes that Buddha found spiritual truth while meditating. Zane believes or thinks that Jesus changed water into wine. So you can sense the difference between those already, and I would encourage you just to think for a minute, which one of those would you circle in which contexts? Now, the way we set this up, there were 5 what we called well-known fact contexts, such as that Brazil is in South America, 5 esoteric fact contexts, such as bronze contains more copper than tin, and 5 everyday life fact contexts, such as that his final paper was due on June 18th. And then 10 of our stimuli were either Christian or Buddhist attitude ascriptions, and these came in 2 randomized orderings. Also, as I mentioned earlier, it was paper and pencil in most places, except it was oral in rural Ghana. That was simply how we had to do it for the language Fanta. So what were our results? What we found is what we predicted, and we found this in all locations with very significant effects, namely believe, or its hypothesized counterpart, is more likely for religious versus matter-of-fact attitude ascriptions. So you might have sensed this as you were viewing the stimuli yourself. People tended to choose Zane believes, rather than thinks, that Jesus changed water into wine. So let's just look at a visual representation of this for a moment. So we see that the blue bars are the ones that represent the portion of believe responses. The pink were the portion of think responses. And on the left side of each of these, we see the religious contexts receive believe or its hypothesized counterpart much more than in the matter-of-fact contexts. Well, this might lead you to the question, what happens in a free response paradigm? Is this simply an artifact of the fact that we were making participants choose one or another? So our free response paradigm was the same set of stimuli, but participants could just fill in and offer a verb of their choice, and we had coders code for what various verbs were being used. And we found the overall same pattern of effect with significant results again. And there's a lot going on here. but just to zero in on what to focus on, the yellow bars represent the portion of believe responses. And the top row, these are the religious attitude contexts. And the bottom row, these are the matter-of-fact attitude contexts. And as you can see, there's a big drop from religious to matter-of-fact in the portion of usages of believe. Now, one other thing of interest is that we also found many people use the word know, not surprising, it's a common verb, but this was also much more common, know was much more common in the matter-of-fact attitude contexts than in the religious context in all but one place but Ghana, which is a very interesting result, and we'll come back to Ghana later in the presentation. But the overall picture of a greater usage of believe for religious attitude reports rather than matter-of-fact attitude reports held up very well in study 2. That brings us to our third study, namely vignettes. And here it's best just to look at the a sample stimuli pair that we presented participants with because that'll give you the idea. So what we did with the vignettes was we kept the ascribed attitude content the same, but we varied the context to be more religious or matter-of-fact. So here's a vignette pair, and again, these were in randomized order, and we had a total of 10 vignettes. One vignette would run like this. Terry had bad headaches in the afternoons all last year. Sometimes her friends offered her aspirin, but Terry belonged to the Church of Christ Scientist. That church teaches that prayer is the way to cure illness and medicine is not. So Terry always refused the aspirin her friends offered. That's because she, forced choice, thinks or believes that aspirin is not a cure. That's obviously a religious attitude report context. But we also had one that went like this. Carrie had bad headaches in the afternoons all last year. Sometimes her friends offered her aspirin, but Carrie took courses at a medical school. That school teaches that drinking water is the way to cure a headache and aspirin is not. So Carrie always refused the aspirin her friends offered. That's because she, forced choice, thinks or believes that aspirin is not a cure. So we see we're ascribing the same content, namely that aspirin is not a cure, but varying the situation to be more religious or more matter-of-fact. And that's to control for the hypothesis that it's content that's driving the difference in our previous studies. So what were the results? Here we found an effect in the same direction. So namely, believe is more likely for religious versus matter-of-fact attitude reports. And we see that in the US, Thailand, China, and Vanuatu with the blue bars here. However, we did not see such an effect in Ghana. If you look at this, basically the same religious versus matter-of-fact attitude reports. But we had significant results in every other location. So again, we're still asking what's going on with Ghana that makes it slightly different, and that's a matter for future research. So let's pull back and look at the big picture now. And this is our interpretation of our results. It's first worth noting that there were impressive similarities across sites. We saw a couple of interesting differences in Ghana, but overall, the main hypothesis held up, which is that speakers are using different verbs to mark different attitudes, religious credence versus factual belief. So that was what we're saying here. Matter of fact and religious attitude descriptions are treated differently. We also think we managed to rule out alternate explanations, such as the sentence subject certainty, content, participant objections, and whether or not it was a weird cultural context. So the fact that we used everyday life facts versus well-known facts versus esoteric facts and did it across cultures as well as the controlled content vignette study, we think shows that that rules out alternate explanations. So given that, we think the best explanation for our data is that participants could understand other agents as capable of distinct cognitive attitudes of religious credence and matter-of-fact belief, and they find ways to mark this difference in their home languages. For future research, again, we should investigate what are the sources of some of the differences we found in Ghana? But the broader lesson we think still holds up. And the broader lesson is this: across cultures, theory of mind includes representations of many different cognitive attitudes, including different varieties of belief. And that brings us to the very end. So thank you to our funders, and see our paper in the cognitive science proceedings and some of our colleagues.